Harriet Combe. 30 years the housekeeper of Wexford House, and when the family could not pay her, they handed her a broken cabinet instead. £1, 4 shillings. A fortnight's wage in a thing no one wanted. She did not argue, she asked only for the cart. 12 saleroom men had already refused it. Across 2 valuations, in 2 years not one would even write it down. Mr. Reuben Halkett, the most respected auctioneer on Corn Street, said it twice, in front of the whole trade. That is not furniture, Mrs. Combe, that is kindling with a door. For 2 years it was the standing joke of Bristol, then 2 porters tipped it down the stairs. The back panel cracked, and Harriet, kneeling to catch the splinter, saw that the back was not 1 board. It was 2 with a space between. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back. Bristol, in the summer of the Jubilee. 1887. The whole country hung with bunting for the old Queen, 50 years on the throne. Down on Lisle Row, the flags were fewer. Wexford House kept its curtains half drawn, the way a house does when a man has died in it, and the money died with him. Harriet Combe had come to that house a girl of 31. She was 61 now, 30 years. She had seen Cyrus Vane rise from a man with 1 warehouse to a man with 3. She had watched him bury his wife. She had watched him grow quiet, then grow ill, then go. And in all that time, she had kept the house the way you keep a promise. Every surface clean, every hinge oiled, every morning the same rounds, whether the master noticed or not. There was one habit the other servants teased her for. In the front hall, in the darkest corner, stood an old lacquered cabinet. Black once, gone grey now, in patches, where the shine had worn away. The doors did not sit quite square. The stand under it was plain and pale and did not match. It was, everyone agreed, the ugliest thing in the house. And Harriet dusted it. Every single day, not because she was told to. She had been told, more than once, not to bother. "Leave the old wreck be, Mrs. Combe," the master had said once, laughing. "It's not worth the cloth you wipe it with." But she wiped it anyway. She had a saying for it, the sort of saying that sounds foolish until you've lived long enough to know it isn't. A thing kept is a thing respected. She did not believe the cabinet was worth anything. She simply did not believe in leaving a thing to rot because other people had stopped looking at it. So every morning, before the fires, she took her soft cloth to the black lacquer. She worked it into the carved edges. She rubbed the dull face until a little of the old shine came up under her hand, then faded again by afternoon, and every morning she put the cloth away and thought no more about it. Here is a thing she never once thought about. In 30 years, that cabinet had never moved. Not an inch. It stood in the same corner she had first seen it in, the year she came. When the master rearranged the drawing room, it stayed. When they took up the hall carpet and put down another, they lifted the cabinet a hand's breadth, swept beneath it, and set it straight back down. Every man who ever came to look at it looked at it from the hall doorway. 6 feet off, at least. Hat in hand. None of them ever crossed the floor to it. None of them ever laid a hand on the wood. 30 years, and nobody had moved that cabinet. Harriet knew one odd thing about it, and even that she thought nothing of. When she dusted the back, and she was the only soul who ever dusted the back, the wood sounded hollow under her knuckles. A dull, empty knock, like tapping the side of a drum. But old cases were like that, she supposed, full of dead air and old joins. She never gave it a second's thought. And there was the veneer at the top left corner of the case. It had lifted, just a little, over the years, curled up from the wood beneath, like a lip beginning to peel. She had smoothed it down 100 times with her thumb, and 100 times it had crept back up. She meant to fix it, one day, with a little glue. She never did. Remember the hollow sound? Remember the lifted corner? Harriet forgot them both. You should not. The refusals began 2 years before the master died. Cyrus Vane had a spell of ill health in 85, and being a careful man, he called in the sale-rooms to put a value on his goods. Just in case. 4 men came from the first firm. They went through the house room by room, and Harriet walked behind them with her hands folded, listening. They were kind about most things. The dining table, the good chairs, the clock on the stair. Numbers went into a little book. Then they reached the hall. Harriet watched them stop in the doorway. She watched them look at the cabinet, all 4 together, the way men look at a thing they've already decided about. One of them tilted his head. Another sniffed. "The stand's wrong for it," the first one said. "Whole thing's a muddle. Lacquer's gone. Look at it. Grey as a gravestone." They did not go in. Not one of them walked to it. From 6 feet in the doorway, they made their judgment. Not worth the cartage, they said. It would cost more to haul it to the sale-room than it would ever fetch there. Leave it. One of them did notice something, though he made nothing of it. The right-hand door of the cabinet hung a fraction proud of the left, sprung on its hinge, he said, and let it drop from his mouth like a fault. Even the doors won't shut. He wrote nothing down. They moved on to the linen. And that was the first refusal. The next year, 86, the master called a different firm. He'd not liked the first. And being a man who believed a second opinion cost nothing, he tried again. 5 men this time, younger, sharper, quicker with their tongues. They laughed at the cabinet. Openly, Harriet stood in the passage and heard them laugh. The stand set them off, that pale, plain stand beneath the black case. "Would you look at that?" one said. "Somebody's married a good old carcass to a cheap new leg." They took it for a fake. A cobbled-together thing, a case stuck on a stand that never belonged to it, dressed up to fool a fool. And who dresses up rubbish, they said, but a man with rubbish to sell? They did not trust a stick of it after that. A marriage of 2 mismatched things read, to them, as a lie. Here is what they could not see, from the doorway, with their clever eyes. Sometimes 2 real things get put together. Sometimes a very old case does get set on a newer stand, because the old one rotted, or broke, or was left behind an ocean away. A mismatch is not always a lie. Sometimes it's a history. But you would have to walk across the room to wonder about that, and they never did. 5 men. The second refusal. Then, in the winter of 86 into 87, Cyrus Vane died. The house went quiet in a new way. The nephew came. Mr. Edmund Vane, a narrow young man in a good coat, who had never lived in the house and did not want it. He inherited the lot. He also inherited, it turned out, a great deal of debt against the lot, which is a thing that surprises heirs more often than you would think. To settle the estate, the goods had to be valued one last time, properly for the sale, and for this the solicitor sent for the best, Halkett and Pring, of Corn Street, and Mr. Reuben Halkett came himself. Harriet had heard of him for years. Everyone in service had. He was the man the great houses called when they wanted a true figure. He walked with his chin up and his hands behind his back, and 2 junior men trailing him with the books. He went through Wexford House like a doctor through a ward, and his numbers were higher than the others, because he knew what things were, and he was not shy to say so. Until the hall. Harriet was there for it. She had learned over 3 valuations to be there for it. She stood by the stair with a duster in her apron pocket, and she watched Reuben Halkett stop in the hall doorway and look at her cabinet. He looked at it a long time, longer than the others had. For one moment, one single moment, Harriet's heart did something foolish in her chest. She thought, this one is going to walk over. This one is going to touch it. He did not. He nodded a junior forward instead. The young man crossed, reluctant, and Halkett called instructions from the door. The cornice. Wrap the cornice. The junior reached up and knocked the moulding along the top of the case. There was a repair there, an old one, a crude patch where the cornice had once been broken and mended by someone with more haste than skill. The junior's knuckle found it. "Been mended, sir?" "Badly." "Of course it has," said Halkett, from 6 feet away. He had not moved. "Everything about it is bad." "Come away." The junior came away, glad to, and Reuben Halkett delivered the line that would follow Harriet through the rest of the story. He said it half to the solicitor, half to the room, in the easy voice of a man performing for people who will repeat him. "That is not furniture, Mrs. Combe," he said her name, because she was standing there, and because it made a better joke with a name in it. "That is kindling with a door." The juniors laughed. The solicitor smiled. And Harriet Combe stood by the stair with her hands folded and said nothing at all, because she believed, she truly believed, that a housekeeper had no standing to hold an opinion a gentleman like Reuben Halkett would hear. He carried the joke back to Corn Street. Kindling with a door. It went round the sale-rooms like a good coin. For the rest of that year, if a man wanted to call a thing worthless in the Bristol trade, he called it kindling with a door, and everyone knew where the phrase had been born. And everyone laughed. 12 men, all told, had now looked at that cabinet. 12 men had refused it, and the 12th had made it famous for being worth nothing. Remember the cornice repair, the crude mend that Halkett would not cross the floor to examine. A man who mends a broken thing in a hurry usually has a reason to hurry, but you would have to be curious about the mend to ask what it was hiding. And Reuben Halkett was not curious. He was certain. Now the estate had to be settled, and this is where the true unkindness comes. The debts against Wexford House were worse than anyone had let on. The good furniture went first, the table, the chairs, the clock, carted off to the sale-room to be turned into cash for the creditors. Room after room went bare. The house Harriet had kept for 30 years was stripped down to the wallpaper and the echo, and still there was not enough coin to go round. There is a particular cruelty in the way estates are settled. The creditors are paid, the lawyers are paid, and the servants, the people who kept the house standing while the family lived and died in it, come last, if they come at all. Mr. Pruitt, the solicitor, worked his ledger like a man bailing a boat. Mr. Edmund Vane wanted only to sign what needed signing and be gone to London. And when they came at last to the household wages, there was not enough left in coin to pay them. They gathered in the emptied hall to settle up. It had a terrible sound now, that hall, with everything gone. Their voices came back off the bare walls. One by one the servants were paid, in short coin and long apology, and one by one they left. And then it was Harriet's turn. She was owed a fortnight, £1, 4 shillings. It is not a large sum. It was, to a woman of 61 with 30 years behind her and no house left to keep, the whole world for a little while. Mr. Pruitt looked at his ledger. Mr. Edmund Vane looked at the window. And then Mr. Pruitt had his idea, and it was the kind of idea that solves a small problem for a comfortable man by handing a large one to a poor woman. "There is the cabinet," he said. They all looked at it. It stood alone in its corner, the last thing in the hall, the last thing in the whole house, because it was the only thing not worth the carting. The great house stripped to nothing, and that one despised object left standing in the dark, waiting. "You may take the cabinet," said Mr. Pruitt, "in lieu of your wage. £1, 4 shillings we'll call it, and consider it a kindness, Mrs. Combe, for the truth is it's worth a good deal less than that. You'd be doing the estate a service, taking it off our hands, otherwise it goes for firewood with the rest of the rubbish." Firewood, there it was again. Kindling with a door. Edmund Vane said nothing. To him the servants and the rubbish were one and the same, One more class of thing to be cleared out of a house he did not want. He saw no difference between paying an old woman in a broken cabinet and sweeping a broken cabinet into the yard. It was all the same clearing. Harriet Combe stood in the empty hall and understood exactly what was being done to her. 30 years, and this was the settlement. A joke of the trade, in place of honest coin. She could have wept, she could have argued, she could have named the years one by one and shamed them with the counting. She did not. She straightened her back, and it was a back that had bent over that lacquer 10,000 mornings, and she looked Mr. Pruitt in the eye, and she said, "I'll take it, and I'll thank you for the cart to move it." That was all. She would not give them the sight of her breaking. She accepted the insult with a straight spine, because a straight spine was the one thing in that house they could not take off her and sell. And so it was hers, the one thing 12 men had refused, the one thing left in the dark, hers for a fortnight's wage she would never see in silver. But the estate had a condition. Of course it did. She had a fortnight to remove it. 14 days. If the cabinet still stood in that hall when the term ran out, it went to the yard with the last of the sweepings and was burned. Take it now, or lose it. That was the mercy on offer. Now understand what that meant for a woman of 61. The cabinet was heavy, not heavy for a young porter's back, perhaps, but heavy the way old furniture is heavy, dead heavy, a weight with no give in it. It stood in the front hall of Wexford House, Harriet's lodging, the small room she had taken, cheap, above a chandler's 2 streets off, now that the house that had been her home for 30 years was closed to her, was up a lane and across a yard. And between the cabinet and the lane were 2 full flights of stairs. She could not move it alone. She knew that the moment she'd said yes. And she had almost no money to pay anyone else, because the whole reason the cabinet was hers was that there had been no money. She sat in her little room that first night and did the sum a poor person does, the sum where every shilling is a stone you carry. She could hire 2 porters for a day. It would cost her most of what small savings she had scraped by in the last hard weeks. It would leave her short. It would leave her frightened at 61 with no post and no house. And she thought, why? Why spend the last of it on this? On a broken thing 3 separate firms of experts had laughed out of the county? On kindling with a door? She could have let it burn. No one would have blamed her. It would have been the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the thing anyone would have understood. Let them have their firewood. Walk away with your straight back and your empty pocket and your dignity, and forget the ugly old wreck ever existed. She sat with that for a long time in the lamplight. And here is the thing about Harriet Combe, the thing you already know if you loved her when I asked you to. She had dusted that cabinet every morning for 30 years. Not because it was worth anything. Because a thing kept is a thing respected, and she found, when it came to it, that she could not respect a thing for 30 years and then hand it to the fire because rich men had told her it was rubbish. It was hers now, the one thing in all that house that was hers. She would not let them burn the one thing she had. That is not a sensible reason. It is a better one. So she spent the money. She hired 2 porters, 2 big, cheerful, careless young men who did this sort of work all over Bristol and thought nothing of it, and on the last but one day of her fortnight she went back to the empty house to bring her cabinet out. It was strange to walk into Wexford House and hear her own steps ring. Every room bare. The hall she had crossed 10,000 times, gone hollow and cold, and in the corner, in the dark, exactly where it had stood for 30 years, the cabinet, waiting for her. The last thing left, the only thing that had never moved. The porters looked at it, and one of them whistled through his teeth. That the one, Mrs.? All this fuss for that? But they were decent enough lads, and they set to. They got their hands under it, and this was the first time in 30 years that any hands but Harriet's dusting cloth had truly taken hold of the thing, and they rocked it up off the floor, and they swore at the weight of it, laughing because young men swear and laugh at weight. "Heavier than it looks," said the second one, "by a mile." They walked it out of its corner. They tilted it back onto a barrow to take it to the top of the stairs. And that was when the fifth thing happened, the last of the small things Harriet was meant to forget, and you were meant to keep. The first porter, resting the case a moment against the stair rail, gave the back of it a knock with his knuckles, the way a man does. Idle, and the back answered him hollow. That dull, empty drum sound Harriet had heard 1,000 times with her dusting hand, and never once questioned. The porter grinned. "Hear that?" He rapped it again, harder, knock, knock, and that deep, empty knock coming back, packed with the old man's gold. That's what that is. Hollow as a church. "There's a fortune in here, missus, mark me." And he laughed at his own joke, and his mate laughed with him, and they hoisted the cabinet toward the stairs. Harriet said nothing. She heard the hollow. She had always heard it, and now a stranger's knuckle had found it too, and made a joke of it. The same joke everyone made, gold in the ugly box, and moved on. But something in her had gone very quiet and very still. She did not know what it was. She only knew, standing in that bare hall, that for the first time in 30 years she was hearing that hollow sound from the outside, in another man's hand, and it did not sound to her like nothing. She said nothing. She followed them to the stairs. And now, at last, we come to the meaning that was hidden inside the whole story from the very first line, though no one had said it out loud, least of all Harriet. 12 men had looked at this cabinet, 4, then 5, then 3. 12 men, all told, and every one of them a professional, paid to know the worth of things. And do you know what not one of them had ever done? Not one of them had ever touched it. They had appraised it from the doorway, 6 feet off, hat in hand, from across the room. They had judged its whole worth by its face, and its face was grey and worn and married to the wrong stand, and so they had condemned it, all 12, without ever once laying a hand on the wood. And now here was Harriet Combe, 61 years old, and she was the only one who ever had to touch it. She could not appraise it from the doorway. She had no clever eye. She had a fortnight and a debt and 2 flights of stairs. Where 12 men had stood back and pronounced, she had to get her hands on it, her shoulder under it, her whole tired body against the weight of the thing. She was the only one, in all its long life in that dark corner, who ever had to carry it instead of judge it. And you cannot carry a thing without learning what the men who only looked at it never could. The porters took it down the first flight well enough, grunting, joking, sure of themselves. It was on the second flight that it happened. The stairs turned there, and the turn was tight, and the cabinet was heavy and long, and the second porter, coming down backward, misjudged the wall. The case swung. His mate lost his grip for half a second, just half a second, and the whole dead weight of the thing lurched sideways and came down hard against the sharp stone edge of a step. There was a sound, not a crash, worse than a crash, a long, splitting, tearing sound, wood giving way along a line, and it ran the length of the back of the cabinet from top to bottom. No, the first porter had it again in a moment. They both did. They hauled it upright and got it steady on the landing, faces white. But the damage was done. Right across the back, from the cornice to the base, the timber had split open in a jagged line, a long wound in the wood. They were mortified. They fell over themselves apologizing. Broken it. Missus. Look. Gone and split the back of it. We're that sorry, though you could hear the second thought under the first. The thought that it was only kindling anyway, only an old wreck. What did it matter? But they were decent lads, and they were sorry. And they stood there wringing their caps and waiting for the old woman to be angry. Harriet Combe knelt down on the landing. Her knees were not good, and the boards were hard, and she went down anyway, slow, one hand on the wall. She knelt in front of the broken back of her cabinet, and the porters fell silent, thinking she was grieving over it. Thinking the poor old thing was going to weep over her firewood. She was not grieving. She was looking. She was looking at the split, close up, in the grey light of the stairwell, with her own eyes, from 6 inches, not 6 feet. And what she saw, in the raw torn edge of that long crack, stopped the breath in her chest. The back of the cabinet was not one board. It was two. 2 flat boards, one behind the other. And between them, where the wood had torn apart, there was a space. A gap. A dark, thin, deliberate hollow running the whole height of the case, sealed away behind a false back that 30 years of dusting hands had knocked on and called old air. Not damage. Design, the porters were still talking. Something about a joiner, something about a few nails. It'll mend, Mrs. Honest. Harriet did not hear a word of it. She reached out, slow, and she laid her fingers against the split edge of the outer board, and she felt the cool dark of the space behind it. And every small thing she had been told for 30 years to forget came back to her all at once and stood up in a row. The hollow knock, the lifted corner of veneer, the doors that would not sit square, the stand that did not match. The crude men to the cornice, the hurried repair, Reuben Halkett, would not cross the floor to question. She had been told by 12 men for 30 years that this thing was empty. She worked her fingers into the crack. The wood was cold, colder than the room. She felt that first, before anything else, the deep cool of a space that no warmth had ever reached. Her fingers found the edge of the inner board and stopped. The porters had gone quiet again. She did not pull. She was 61 and her hands shook a little even on a good day, and she knew that if there was something in there worth the trembling, she would not forgive herself for tearing it. So she worked slow. She hooked one finger behind the cracked outer board and drew it back, gentle the way she had lifted 100 loose things off Cyrus Vane's shelves over 30 years, and the panel came away from the case with a small, dry sound. Like a page. And there it was. Not one board. 2. She had it in her own eyes now, plain as the light on the landing. An outer board and an inner board, set 1.5 inches apart, and the whole tall gap between them running from the floor of the case to the top. A hollow built on purpose, a room inside a wall. "Missus?" one of the porters said. "It'll mend." "I told you." "A join'll be still," Harriet said. She did not raise her voice. She never had. But something in the 2 flat words put the man's cap back in his hands, and both of them stood there while the old woman leaned her face close to the dark of the cavity and looked. There was something in it. Not gold. She would tell you later she never thought gold, not for one heartbeat, because a woman who has counted every shilling of £1.4 does not let herself think gold. But there was a shape in the dark, a flat pale shape wedged upright in the narrow space, and she reached in with 2 fingers and touched it, and it was not metal, and it was not wood. It was paper, a packet of paper. Folded flat, tied round with a ribbon so old the colour had gone out of it, dry as a moth's wing, pressed into that narrow black room and left there by a hand she would never know. She drew it out 1 inch. It caught. She eased it, and it slid free into the grey light of the stairwell, and Harriet Combe knelt on the hard boards of Wexford House with a bundle of another man's words in her lap, and did not, for a long moment, breathe at all. She had expected coin. Or nothing. She had not expected words. The porters wanted to see. Of course they did. The one who'd joked about the old man's gold craned his neck, and Harriet turned her shoulder, slow, and put her body between the packet and his eyes, and she said, quiet, that they'd earned their money and there was tea in the pot downstairs if they wanted it. They took the hint. Grown men, both of them, and they went down the last flight sideways past the tipped cabinet with the look of men who had walked into something they didn't have the size for. She stayed on the landing a while longer. Alone, then she got the cabinet down the last flight herself, or near enough, she and the two of them together, gentler now. All three of them minding the broken back like it was a hurt child, and out across the yard and up onto the borrowed cart. And she went home to her one clean rented room on Lisle Row with the despised thing lashed upright behind her and the packet buttoned inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel the flat, dry weight of it the whole way. That night she did not sleep. She lit her one lamp and set it on the table, and she untied the ribbon. It came apart in her fingers like a cobweb, and she spread the papers out, flat, and she looked at them the way she looked at everything the gentleman wrote, knowing the shapes of the letters, not the meaning of them, because Harriet Combe could read a hymn number and a butcher's bill, and not a great deal more, and she had never once been ashamed of it until this exact moment, when she needed the words and could not have them. There were many pages. Some were printed, with lines ruled across them, and columns and small tight handwriting filling the columns in ink gone brown. Some were letters, long ones, close written, folded and creased soft, and on one of the printed sheets near the top there was a mark she did know, because she had dusted it off a dozen crates in the master's cellar in the early years. A crest, a shield with a small ship on it, and words curved round. She could not read the words, but she knew the ship. And she knew, sitting there in the lamplight in a room that smelled of the tallow candle and the old wood, that she was the only person alive who had ever seen the inside of that cabinet. Not Cyrus Vane, not his nephew, not one of the 12 men who had stood in the hall doorway and priced it from 6 feet off. 12 men had valued the outside of the thing. And the woman who'd had to carry it had found the inside. She could not read it. So the next morning she took it to someone who could. The merchant's record room stood on Queen Square, a tall grey building with a green door, and Harriet had never in her life had cause to go through it. She almost didn't. She stood on the step a good 5 minutes with the packet in a cloth bag against her hip, feeling every inch the housekeeper at the tradesman's entrance, feeling that a woman like her had no business bringing papers to a room full of clerks and being taken as anything but a nuisance. Then she thought of Reuben Halkett's face in the hall, and the 2 words kindling and door, and she went in. The clerk who took her was a young one, thin, spectacled, ink on his cuff. He had the impatient courtesy of a man with a full desk, and he asked her what it was she wanted, and she set the packet on the counter and said she wanted to know what the papers said. That was all. What they said. He untied them the way she had, and he lifted the first printed sheet to the window, and his face changed. She watched it change. She had grown very good, over 30 years, at reading faces. Since faces were the one text she'd never had trouble with, she watched the impatience go out of him. She watched him set the sheet down very carefully and pick up the next. She watched him lean closer to the little brown columns and turn a letter to catch the light and go still. "Where did you come by these?" he said. "They came to me," Harriet said, with a cabinet. He looked at her then, properly, over the top of his spectacles, and he asked her to sit, and he sent the office boy for the senior man, and Harriet Combe sat on a hard chair in the merchant's record room on Queen Square, with her hands folded in her lap, and waited to be told what she already, in her bones, had begun to understand. It took them the better part of the morning. 2 of them at it, then 3, one fetching a great ledger of his own to lay a sheet beside, comparing hands, comparing the ruled columns, murmuring across the counter in the low, pleased voices men use when a thing is turning out to be more than they hoped. And here, near enough, is what they told her. The printed sheets with the little ship on the crest were bills of lading, cargo papers. They listed goods carried by ship, from where to where, in whose name, on what date, and the dates on these were old. Not old the way a Victorian remount is old old the way the century before the last is old. 1690-something, the senior man said, tapping the brown ink. The goods had come through the East India Company. Lacquerwork, cabinets and screens and chests, brought by sea round half the world, landed and sold and scattered into the houses of men rich enough to want them. And one line on one sheet, the clerk turned it so she could see, though she still could not read it, one line named a lacquered cabinet, a japanned case. Its measurements written out in a dead man's hand 200 years gone. And the measurements, the senior man said, drawing them off the paper and holding his hands apart to show her, were the measurements of the thing standing lashed upright in her rented room on Lisle Row. The case was real. The case was old. The case had crossed the world by sail while Bristol was a young town, and someone, a century on, had set it on a new English stand because the first one had rotted or broken, or simply gone out of taste, and that plain, pale 19th century stand, the very thing the saleroom men had jeered at as wrong, as cobbled on, as proof the whole piece was a cheat. That was not a cheat. That was a marriage. An old, true case rehoused, and the papers in its back proved which half was which. The mismatch that had condemned it was the thing that saved it. The clerk said as much, out loud, half to himself, turning the stand line and the case line side by side. They'd read the stand and thrown out the case. They'd looked at the newest part of the thing and priced the whole by it. Harriet sat very still and thought, yes, that is exactly what they did. To the cabinet. And she did not say to me. But it was the letters that stopped her heart the second time. The clerks got to those after the noon bell. Private letters, they said, folded in among the trade papers, and these took longer, because a personal hand is harder than a printed column, and the ink had faded worse. The senior man read them slow, and as he read, the pleased trade murmur went out of his voice, and he read slower still, and once he looked up at her, quick, and then down again, and did not say what he'd been going to say. The letters, he told her at last, fixed the whole account. Named the ship, named the voyage, named the man the cabinet had been consigned to, and the man after him, and the house it had come to rest in. An unbroken line. Not a gap in it, anywhere. 200 years of ownership, written down and tied up, and sealed in the dark behind a false board, so that the case did not just look old, it could prove every year of its age, hand to hand, all the way to the corner of the hall on Lisle Row, where a housekeeper had dusted it, and been told to leave off wasting her rag. "Do you understand what that is?" the clerk asked her. Gently, the way you'd ask a child or an old woman, and she was neither offended nor a child. She said she thought she was beginning to. He said the word twice so she would keep it. Provenance, the paper history of a thing. Where it came from, proven, without a hole. Most old things, he said, however fine, have lost their story. A cabinet like this, with its whole story attached, he stopped and chose his words and said it was the rarest part of the whole business. Rarer than the lacquer any rich man could buy, the proof no one could fake. Harriet Combe walked home along the harbour with the copied notes the clerk had pressed on her and the packet buttoned once more against her chest, and she should, by every right, have been the happiest woman in Bristol. She was not. She was afraid. Because here is what she understood, walking home. She had, in her rented room, a thing worth a sum she could not even name. And she had no standing. That was the plain truth of her, the truth she'd carried 30 years, the blind spot she couldn't see round, that a woman like her did not get to hold an opinion the gentleman would hear. She could stand in the record room and be believed by kind clerks. That was one thing. But the moment she carried this out into the trade, into Corn Street, into the world of Reuben Halkett and Edmund Vane, what would happen? She knew what would happen. She'd thought it through by the time she reached her door. Edmund Vane would say it was a mistake. He'd say the cabinet had been given her in error, that no one meant to hand a servant a fortune. that a gift made in lieu of £1 4 shillings could not have meant to include the contents, and that the papers, being the family's papers, were the family's still. And a solicitor, Mr. Pruitt, with his ledger, would find the words to make it stick, because that was the way the world she lived in was built. She had watched it built, room by room, for 30 years, a fortnight's wages given in charity. Did such a gift hold? She lay awake on it a second night. She did not know. And not knowing was worse than any answer. She could have hidden it, sold it quiet to a stranger in another town, and asked no questions and answered none. She thought about that too. And in the end she did not do it, and the reason she did not do it is the whole of who she was, because a thing done in the dark is a thing you've agreed is shameful, and she had done nothing shameful. She had carried her own cabinet down her own stairs and found what was hers to find. So she did the opposite of hiding. She took it to the one man who could never ever say she'd invented it. She took it to Reuben Halkett. She chose him on purpose. She understood that much about the world, if not her own standing in it, that Halkett had said the words in front of the whole trade. Twice, that is not furniture, Mrs. Combe, that is kindling with a door. He had made it the joke of Corn Street. His refusal was on the record, in a dozen men's memories, and that meant when he changed his mind, no one could say she'd bought his opinion or bent it. The man's own scorn was her witness. She saw that clear walking to Corn Street with the packet in the cloth bag, and it was the cleverest thing she ever did, and she'd have told you she wasn't clever. Halkett and Pring stood halfway down Corn Street with a polished counter and a brass rail and a smell of beeswax and old ledgers. Halkett was behind the counter. A junior beside him, one of the two who'd come to value the estate, the very one who'd tapped the cornice and pulled a face. They both knew her. She saw the junior's mouth start to make the shape of a smile, the shape men make when the joke walks in the door. Harriet Combe set the cloth bag on the polished counter and untied it and laid the packet down flat on the wood in front of Reuben Halkett, and she said, "You valued my cabinet, Mr. Halkett. I've brought you the rest of it." Halkett looked at the packet the way you look at a dead bird a cat's brought in. Amused, faintly put upon. He was a big, careful man with grey at his temples and a firm's reputation for shrewdness to protect, and protecting it was the whole of his life. He glanced at the junior, and the junior smirked, and Halkett, to be kind to the old woman, to get her out of his shop, picked up the top sheet and turned it to the window light. He read one line. She watched him read it. She was watching his face, of course she was, faces were her one book, and she saw the amusement go out of it exactly the way it had gone out of the young clerks on Queen's Square, only slower, because Halkett had further to fall. His eyes went along the line and stopped, went back to the start of it, along again. He read the second line aloud, half of it, without meaning to. The way a man reads when the words have got ahead of his manners, the ship's name, and a date, and the little curved words round the crest with the ship on it. And then Reuben Halkett, the most respected auctioneer on Corn Street, the man who had priced her whole life at less than nothing, from 6 feet away, reached behind himself, without looking, and found his stool, and sat down on it. The junior said, "It's still only a case, sir, whatever the paper says. The stand's wrong, we all be quiet," Halkett said. He said it the way she'd said it to the porter on the landing. 2 words, flat, and the young man's mouth shut. Halkett did not look up from the sheet. He read the next, and the next, laying each one down as careful as she had, his big hands suddenly gentle on the brown paper. And Harriet Combe stood at his counter with her back straight, and her hands folded, and watched a respected man learn, line by line, what a servant had known since a stairwell 2 nights before. An old woman standing, a respected man sitting. That was the shape of it. She has said, in the years since, that she did not enjoy it the way you'd think. It was quieter than that. It was just true, at last, out in the light, and true is a calmer thing than victory. Halkett did not argue. That was the part she'd braced for, and it never came. He could not argue. The papers were the authority, and they sat above him, above his firm, above the whole habit of the trade, and he was enough of a real expert, under the shrewdness he sold, to know it the moment he read it. And then, to his credit, and it is his one bit of credit in this story, he did the honest thing. He called the trade in to look. One by one, over the days that followed, they came. Halkett summoned them, the men of Corn Street, the two firms that had refused it, the junior who'd tapped the cornice, and made each one stand at his counter and read the sheets. He did not soften it for them. He laid the bills of lading in the window light and made them read the date and the crest and the measurements that matched the case now standing, still cracked at the back, brought round on a cart and set up in Halkett's own showroom for the trade to see. The man from the second firm came, the one whose people had laughed in 1886 and called the stand a fake. He turned the shipping document to the window, the same movement they all made, and he stood there a long while with the paper up to the light, and he did not laugh. He read the line about the remounting, the old case, the new stand, both real, married honestly a century back, and Harriet, who was there, saw him understand that the very thing his firm had jeered at as a cheat was the proof of the truth. He set the paper down. He looked at the cabinet. He did not look at her, and that was its own kind of answer. The junior came last, because he had been loudest, and Halkett made a small point of that. The boy who had rapped the cornice with 2 knuckles and pronounced it firewood. He read the papers with his ears going red from the collar up, and when he got to the line that dated the case 200 years before his own opinion of it, he went very quiet, and he said, "I didn't." We all only looked at and could not finish it, because there was no end to that sentence that helped him. The porter heard of it too, the one who joked on the landing about the old man's gold. Word travels in a town like Bristol. He'd been nearer right than any of the trade, and he'd been joking, and Harriet, when she heard he'd gone red as fire in the taproom hearing the tale, felt no unkindness toward him at all. He at least had put his hand on the thing. He'd knocked and heard the hollow answer back. He'd been laughing, but he'd been listening, which is more than 12 valuers ever did. No one was argued into respect. Not one of them. That is the thing she understood, watching their faces at the window. The paper did it. She never raised her voice, never said "I told you," never so much as let a look cross her face. She didn't have to. The provenance forced the respect out of them the way a lever forces a stone, slow and against their whole weight, and it moved anyway. And then Reuben Halkett did the thing that settled it. He took a clean sheet of his firm's paper, and his pen, and at his own counter. In front of the junior and 2 of the trade, he wrote 2 figures. At the top he wrote, as broken furniture, condition alone, £6. And beside it, in the small, honest hand of a man writing against his own past self, generous for the cartage. And beneath that he wrote the other figure, the provenance figure, a documented 17th century East India lacquer import, unbroken line, papers entire. He wrote a sum in the high hundreds of pounds, and under it he wrote, and it would climb at auction, and he underlined the climb, because he was an auctioneer to the bone, and he could not help but see the room full of bidders even now. Then he turned the sheet round on the polished counter and slid it across to Harriet Combe. She looked at the 2 figures, £6, and the other. The gap between the 2 lines on that one sheet was the whole of the story, the exact distance between what the trade had seen and what had always, quietly, been true. The distance a thing falls when men price its face and never lift its back. She stood and looked at the gap on the paper for a good while, and no one in the room said one word. "I'd be glad to handle the sale for you, Mrs. Combe," Halkett said, at last. "Head down." Quiet, the firm would wave its usual, "You valued the door, Mr. Halkett," Harriet said. She was not sharp by nature. In 30 years of service she had swallowed 1,000 sharp things she might have said, and said none of them. This was the one. It came out level, and low, no heat in it, which is what made it land. "You valued the door," she said again. I opened it, and that was all she said to him, ever, near enough, on the subject. But she did not sell it in a hurry. And here is the turn that mattered most to her, though it made no one rich and would show up in no ledger, because before she decided anything about the money, she went back to the record room, and she had the young clerk read her the private letters through. All of them, slow, from the first to the last. The letters they'd gone quiet over, the ones the senior man had looked up from and not finished. She sat in the hard chair and had them read to her, and this is what they said. The letters named the founding voyage. The venture the cabinet had come home on was not just some ship. It was the ship, the one whose cargo, sold on, had made the first real money of the Vane house. The money that bought the warehouses, that bought Wexford House on Lisle Row. That paid, year on year for 30 years, the small honest wage of a housekeeper named Harriet Combe. And that, in the last fortnight, the estate could not find £1 4 shillings to pay her, and so had handed her the very object that had begun the whole fortune, as charity, as a thing worth less than nothing. She sat with that a long time. The clerk, kind man, left her to it. She was holding, she understood, the only complete account of a family that had never once in her life asked her opinion about anything. The whole truth of the Vanes, hidden in the back of the one thing they threw away, found by the one person they had never thought to ask. A reversal, in the end, was not the high hundreds of pounds. It was that. It was that she, and no one else, held the true story, that she was the author of it now, the keeper of the record, the one who knew. She read the founding voyage letters alone that night, by her single lamp in the room on Lisle Row, with the cabinet standing open beside her. No one to tell it to, no speech, only her face and the page and the small lamp. And the thing she'd carried down 2 flights of stairs, standing open at last with its dark inner room emptied into the light. She did sell it. In the end, and not in a rush, and through Halkett, because he'd earned the handling of it by reading the trade its lesson one by one. It went for a great deal, more than the high hundreds line, when the bidders got their heat up, just as he'd underlined it would. Enough, not so much that she became the rich woman of the story, because she never wanted to be, and a woman doesn't unlearn 61 years of thrift in one afternoon. Enough to live the rest of her days in a small clean room with a fire she didn't have to count the coals of. Enough for dignity, which was all she'd asked for in the emptied hall when they'd handed her the thing. The cabinet stands, now in a lit room, not a dark hall corner, a small bright room, moved at last into the light, and the doors are open, the first time in 30 years in 200 that its inside faces the day. She had the papers copied, and the copies lodged in the merchant's record room on Queen Square, where a record survives so that the story cannot go dark again. She sees to it the lacquer stays polished, old habit. A thing kept is a thing respected. She always said so. Halkett and Pring writes 4 words on every lot that passes the counter now, provenance to be examined. The junior writes them too, careful, in a hand that has learned to look twice, and Edmund Vane, when he was told what he had cleared out of Wexford House for £1 4 shillings, when someone made sure he was told, said something. He did say something. It was not worth repeating then, and it is not worth repeating now, and Harriet, when she heard it, only nodded, the way you nod at weather. The worth was never in the lacquer. That was the whole of it, the lacquer any rich man could buy. The worth was in the one board no one thought to lift, in the dark 1.5 inches behind a false back that 12 clever men knocked on and called old air. And it was found, it could only have been found, by the one person who had to carry the thing on her own back instead of judging it from across the room. They looked. She lifted. That is the difference the whole story turns on. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, someone who priced your outside and never once thought to try the door, then you already knew how this story had to end. You've known it a long time. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels.